Great. Well, welcome once again, everyone, to the class, True Activity of the Bodhisattva, Diamond Sutra as a Model for Engaging the World. This is class 7, our next to last class. And I believe, hello, Tom, welcome. I believe that we left it at chapter 19 last time, or we actually were discussing chapter 18. So I've just muted you all, and you can unmute yourselves as you would like when you want to speak. So we were talking about the end of chapter 18. And this very well-known phrase, past mind is ungraspable, present mind is ungraspable, future mind is ungraspable. And we spoke a little bit about momentary arising of consciousness and using the light ball as an example of that. And so I wanted to relate that also, just to continue to draw the threads between this teaching and Zen teaching that you might be familiar with. Wanted to relate that to the story of Bodhidharma and Weka, right? So one of the very first teachings that Bodhidharma gave him when he finally accepted him as a student was that Weka said to Bodhidharma, please pacify my mind. My mind is not at ease. Please pacify my mind. And Bodhidharma said, well, bring me your mind and then I will pacify it. Right? And Weka, after some amount of time, we don't know whether that was 5 seconds or 5 minutes or 5 days or 5 months or years, came back and said, I can't find my mind. And Bodhidharma said, well, then I've pacified it for you, haven't I? Right? So it's not a problem anymore. In other words, if you can't find it, then it can't be a problem anymore. So it's in that spirit, I think, that the Diamond Sutra reminds us that neither the past, the present, or the future mind can be grasped, right? And to not see mind as something special, as some special realm that we're looking for in our practice, some special plane of existence out there, other than what we're experiencing. So with that, I'll transition into chapter 19. So, and I'm going to put the text on the screen for a bit, just so we can follow along here. Chapter 19 happens to begin on page 19, right about in here. And so again, the Tathagata asks the Buddha this question about whether a great gift of many jewels would produce a great body of merit. And Subhuti replies, yes, it would. And then the Tathagata, the Buddha, responds, by saying, the body of merit produced as a result, or let's use the Kanza translation, on the strength of that, this son or daughter of good family would beget a great heap of merit, immeasurable and incalculable. But if, on the other hand, there were such a thing as a heap of merit, the Tathagata would not have spoken of a heap of merit. So this chapter is entitled The Teaching That Pervades the Dharma Realm. That's Pine's translation. I think I provided all of you with the chapter, the Buddhist Text Translation Society translation of this text as well. And their translations of the titles are slightly different than the Pine. But essentially, this is an interesting conversation, and this is where there was, I mentioned in the syllabus, a bit of controversy. So Pine mentions the fact that some commentators think that chapter 19 is trying to augment our sense of the value of merit rather than decrease it, as has been done before, of traditional kinds of merit, meaning merit based on offerings. But he says, he admits, he mentions the fact that most of the commentators, that he disagrees with that, and that he thinks that it's continuing to say that merit is empty. And I think the two things are actually true. I happen to agree with the comments that this particular chapter is upholding, to some extent, the value of merit. And it does so by saying that merit is empty, and therefore it is tied into all things. It is related to all things. It is part of the absolute, and is essentially a concept. And yet, interesting, the comments, I really appreciated the comments by Sung Wei on page 326 of the Pine translation. He says, the Tathagata does not speak of such merit as great because merit does not exist. We could say merit does not exist in the independent sense, right? It's one of many phenomena. It is simply a phenomena like any other phenomena. But if donors base themselves on the wisdom of Buddha and remain detached from form in their practice of giving and do not consider merit to be real, this is not false. Therefore, the Tathagata says such merit is truly great. So in other words, by understanding the emptiness of merit and not grasping onto it, then merit itself, the generation of merit itself, is not the goal. But that same activity that is generating merit is actually wholesome activity, is actually necessary activity, is fulfilling the vow of the Bodhisattva to liberate beings. Right? So this particular chapter, as distinct from some of the other chapters that we're trying to point out, the value of action over merit, I think this one is basically saying something more like, don't get hung up on merit as the primary thing, or as rejecting that. Don't get hung up on rejecting that either, right? But see that the activity itself is wholesome, is needed in the world that we live in. And it's needed in order to help beings to come to this realization that merit is empty, right? So that's the subtlety, the subtle difference in this chapter's description of merit as distinct from some of the previous chapters where we talked about merit. So going on then, we're going to move quickly through a couple of chapters here. So chapter 20, let me go back to the screen here. Chapter 20, continuing on the next page. Then we return to the form body of the Buddha. Can the Buddha be seen by means of his form body, or by means of the accomplishment or the development of his form body? So this again relates to merit. The understanding was that the 32 marks of the Buddha were because of his good karma, and therefore you could look at him and see that he was a Buddha. But this chapter says, as we might expect, that the body is also empty. The marks themselves are also empty. They're mere phenomena in the sea of phenomena. And that we'll come back to that a little bit in a minute, because that's also going to come up again in chapter 26. But as we said before, as I mentioned before, the marks of the Buddha are not what make him a Buddha, right? Having an ushnisha, which is the mark on the head, or the marks on the hands and the feet, those are not the things that make him a Buddha. And in 21, the Buddha says something which may sound very familiar to most of us Zen folks, and perhaps much less familiar to other folks in Mahayana traditions, and certainly in the Shravakayana and the Vajrayana traditions. He says, if someone should claim that the Tathagata teaches a Dharma, reading from the Pine translation there on the first paragraph of chapter 21 on page 20, right in here, such a claim would be untrue. Such a view of me, Subhuti, would be a misconception. And how so? In the teaching of a Dharma, Subhuti, in the teaching, quote, teaching of a Dharma, there is no such Dharma to be found as the teaching of a Dharma. So the historical Buddha is quoted as having said that in 49 years he never gave a single teaching. My root teacher, Harada Roshi in Japan, often said, I've never taught any of you anything. So this is in line with our understanding of the Dharma as pointing at reality. It's not adding anything to reality. But then Subhuti again gets a little worried about that and says, well, will anybody believe it? If it's not a real teaching, if there's no teaching here, will anybody believe it? And the Tathagata says, yes, don't worry. There will be beings who will believe it, who will understand it, who will practice it. Even though there are no beings, they are no beings, right? So then this goes to the question of enlightenment, chapter 22, right? So did the Tathagata realize, has the Tathagata fully known the utmost right and perfect enlightenment, reading from the Kanze? Or to be clear, actually, I like the Kanzi translation because he says, is there any dharma by which the Tathagata has fully known the utmost right and perfect enlightenment? So it is, Subhuti. Not even the least dharma is there found or got at, therefore is it called utmost right and perfect enlightenment. So basically here, the Buddha is pointing at the fact that there isn't even enlightenment is a concept. Even there isn't a particular teaching upon which enlightenment depends. As I said, I think in a previous class, there's not some secret handshake or some particular password. Right. But the understanding, and this is that second sentence there, not even the least dharma is there found, therefore is it called the utmost right and perfect enlightenment. That is to say, to realize that reality is completely composed of phenomena, and that any kind of teaching that we encounter is somewhat imperfect in capturing that, but we can have, and do have actually, a lived experience of that. That is enlightenment. If we understand enlightenment as absolute harmony with the true nature of things. So for that reason, he goes directly to, oh, and I do want to say one other thing, which is to not confuse the absolute with the relative. So this statement here in chapter 22 is the absolute standpoint. And Harada Roshi would also hammer home the fact that to make that statement that we already live within enlightenment and that enlightenment is a mere concept is fine from the standpoint of the absolute. And from the standpoint of the mundane subjective world, there is such a thing as realization. There is such a thing as having some kind of lived experience of that or some kind of insight into that. But then this goes to the question of chapter 23, which is one of the more important ones here. The chapter 23 is titled, With Pure Mind, Cultivate That Which is Auspicious. Right? So just as Harada Roshi did, we can talk about enlightenment and pure mind, so to speak, from the absolute perspective. And we do at the beginning of that chapter. Self-identical is that dharma, and nothing therein is at variance, is how Kanze says it. Pine says, undifferentiated is this dharma in which nothing is differentiated. Thus is it called unexcelled perfect enlightenment. And Thich Nhat Hanh gives this lovely turn of phrase, mind is everywhere equally. However, I think that the way he says that might lead us to believe that mind is equal to dharma, is equal to some kind of teaching, and that would be a mistaken connection. So be careful with the lovely turn there. But undifferentiated is this dharma, the dharma of unexcelled perfect enlightenment. by which all wholesome dharmas or all auspicious dharmas are realized. So again, that is to say, as Dogen would have us understand it, enlightenment is the ground of being. Enlightenment is merely saying the harmony of all conditioned things, the harmony of all conditions resolving themselves completely in each instant. And that is happening. Realization, on the other hand, another matter altogether. And that shouldn't prevent us from undertaking activity in the subjective world. So I want to stop for a moment and talk a little bit about this koan that Pine mentions, because his translation is pretty substantially different than Taigen Leighton and Shohaku Okumura did of that koan about the rice field. So let's talk just briefly about that. So I'm using the Eihei Shingi, Dogen's Standards for the Community, as translated by Shohaku-san and Taigen-san, and they give this translation of the koan that Pine mentions. So Guishan and his student Yangshan were on a hillside, and Yangshan was digging to make a rice paddy. Yangshan said, "This place is so low and that place is so high." So you might imagine them, standing there on the hillside, right? Yangshan below Guishan. And Guishan says, "Water makes things equal. Why don't you level it with water?" Yangshan said, "Water is not reliable, teacher. A high place is high level, a low place is low level." And Guishan agreed. Okay. So Yangshan begins the koan by acknowledging the difference between them. Teacher, student, you're at the top of the hill, I'm at the bottom of the hill. There are various, in a very literal sense, there are various terraces, higher and lower places on the hill, right? That's part of what he's doing. He's creating this, these steps that are used for these level areas that are used at different heights for the water. And Guishan says water makes things equal. So water we might think of as the ocean of reality, right? This is water. This is a metaphor. Why don't you just level it with water? Meaning all things are part of the great ocean of reality. So get over the categories. Huh? And Yangshan says, water is not reliable. Meaning we can't live in the absolute. We do live in the midst of the absolute, but we cannot live our lives completely in denial about the state of difference of things. That would be an unskillful view. So he says, a high place is high level, a low place is low level. Meaning even within the absolute integration of all things, a skillful response requires us to acknowledge the differences as well. So the same with this chapter, returning back to the Diamond Sutra for a moment, same with chapter 23, right? So the Dharma is undifferentiated. The Dharma is present in all things. It's integral. And enlightenment is simply that activity, the harmony of that activity. And yet there is such a thing as wholesome dharmas or auspicious dharmas, which is to act in accord with our understanding of that fact, that dharmas are undifferentiated, that we are all undifferentiated. We are all part integral with all things, unique as well, and integral with all things. So there is such a thing as wholesome and unwholesome. Right? You don't throw out the precepts altogether just because you have an understanding of the emptiness and the impermanence of all things. So we don't wait for a perfect understanding. We don't wait for a perfect understanding. We use this imperfect, deluded world as the world of enlightenment, as the world of dharmas that are undifferentiated. Right? We use the wisdom that we encounter in order to have a positive impact on the world. So just to go back a bit, so words and concepts are provisional. That's one of the main points of this sutra. That's one of the main points of this section of the sutra, all the way 19 through 23 or 24. And in a way, it's also telling us that the Dharma teaches itself. That the very activity, the very fact that all things are interrelated means that the Dharma is teaching itself in each moment. So we try to express that. We try to say a word about it or write something about it, right? But ultimately, there's also the teaching of silence, right? This is why we have Vimalakirti in the Vimalakirti Sutra. Vimalakirti's roar is when he remains silent at the question of the meaning of enlightenment. Right. Or we have the koan, usually the first or the second koan, depending on the compilation you're looking at, which is Manjushri says, the king of dharmas is going to speak the dharma, and the Buddha gets up on the seat and says nothing and gets down from the seat. And Manjushri says, did you see that? This was the king of dharma's dharma. Right? Which doesn't mean that silence is a teaching. That's not what it means. It means that our mere existence, just sitting there, is a teaching. Do you see the distinction? His merely sitting, wherever he was sitting, he didn't have to even get up on the teaching seat necessarily, but he did that, right, to demonstrate. Our mere existence is a teaching. That's why we sit zazen, because our mere existence is a teaching. We sit in the midst of that. So that's the emphasis of that section of the sutra. And it ends there with 24. Let me just grab my last little bit of notes there on 24. Reminding us one more time in case we haven't forgotten, that putting this teaching into practice is important, is as important, if not more important, than making donations and giving gifts to the Tathagatas. And that, for me, speaking of koans, brings up the fanning koan. At the end of Genjo koan, there is this lovely little story about Master Baucha, right? And the monk says, basically, let's see if I can remember exactly the San Francisco Zen Center translation. The monk says, the wind is permanent and reaches everywhere. Why are you fanning yourself? The nature of wind is permanent and it reaches everywhere. Why then are you fanning yourself? And Master Baucha says, you understand that the nature of wind is permanent, and yet you don't understand the nature of its reaching everywhere. And so the monk says, well, what is the nature of its reaching everywhere? And Master Baucha just continues fanning himself. Right? So we should be careful with this word permanent. But what it's saying is the Dharma, the nature of Dharma is that it is throughout all things. It's the way that things actually are. All things, the way things actually are. That's the meaning of it being quote unquote permanent. The nature of wind is inherent, would probably be a better way to express it, or a more precise way to express it. But the reaching everywhere is where the monk gets confused. So the way that the Dharma reaches everywhere is through our activity. That's why the master is fanning himself, right? To raise the wind. So it's the same with bodhisattvas. Bodhisattvas bring the Dharma into the world by virtue of their activity. Not that the Dharma wasn't already there, but that we bring it to life. We are instruments of the Dharma. The Dharma comes through us. The wind doesn't happen unless we are doing the fanning. And then when we're doing the fanning, it does happen. It happens in a way that we can feel it, that we can see it. So this might also become more apparent in a future chapter, but that is why I believe that the Buddha returns to, in chapter 24, the reminder to put the sutra into practice. Teach the sutra, put the sutra into practice, after having reminded us that the Dharma is doing its own teaching at all times. So maybe I'll stop there for a moment and see if there are questions or comments before we go on to the material that was actually supposed to be for this class. We haven't even gotten there yet. Okay, I'm going to mute you all again because there's a little bit of background noise there, and you can unmute yourselves if you want to ask a question or make a comment, or we'll just go on. A little bit more. Going once, going twice. No? Okay. Margaret, did you want to say something? Or you're okay there? Okay. All right, so chapter 25. So again, we have some differences in the way that the translators are looking at this particular language, but I believe that it's all pointing pretty much in the same direction here. So let's look at this chapter 25 on page 22. So this is about foolish common people, or about ordinary people is the language that's used here. And so Kanzei translates it, I think, fairly literally. Quote, foolish common people, Subhuti, as really no people, have they been taught by the Tathagata. Therefore are they called foolish common people. So this is the language, this is the kind of phraseology that we've seen before. If we take the quotations to mean something like the idea of foolish common people is really no people, is really empty, right? All beings are empty. That's what they've been taught by the Tathagata. Therefore, are they just common folks? All beings are empty. Therefore, they're common. They all have that in common. And so Pine, looking at Pine, he says, foolish people remain attached to a self, right? So Kanzei had spoken about seizing of a self in the sentence before the one I just read to you. Pine talks about attachment to a self. Foolish people remain attached to their self, to a self, to a being, to a life. And yet they are empty. They are not permanent and not independently arising. And therefore are they called foolish people. Right, because they're confused about that. And it's an idea. Such attachment is merely an idea. But if we look here at Thich Nhat Hanh, Thich Nhat Hanh seems to be saying something different, but actually it's related. So Tathagata, what the Tathagata calls a self essentially has no self in the way that ordinary persons think that there is a self. Okay, right. So the Tathagata is saying that beings are empty. So the Tathagata does not regard anyone as an ordinary person. That is why he can call them ordinary persons. So in other words, if there's no being, there's no ordinary person. It's all phenomena. But then we are all of the same essence, if you will, without getting caught up in an essence as something, permanently existing thing. We are all of the same nature of change, of impermanence, of non-separation. So that makes us ordinary. Okay? So that's chapter 25. Then in 26, we go back to talking about the signs of the Buddha. So ordinary people are part of all the rest of reality, and that's what makes them ordinary people. And Buddhas, who are special, have these 32 marks. So the question is, can someone meditate on the Tathagata by means of the 32 marks? And Subhuti says, yes, but the Buddha corrects him and says, if you say that, then you would confuse me with a Chakravartin king. So a Chakravartin king is also translated usually as a wheel-turning king. And some of you might remember that before the Buddha was born, there was some concern on the part of his parents that he should become a king. And so shortly after the baby was born, they called together 6 sages to come and have a look at him and find out and predict whether he was going to be a king or a wise person. And so 5 of them said, well, either king or wise person. And one of them said, no, definitely a sage, definitely a sage. But the reason why is because it's said that they have the same marks, the wheel-turning king and the Buddha, right? So another reason, another reminder that the marks do not make you a Buddha, right? It's not the signs, it's not the outward signs that make a person a Buddha. So for that reason, the Buddha gives the Gata at the end of chapter 26. And Kanze's translation is the one that Musang actually uses as well. Those who by my form did see me, and those who followed me by voice, wronged the efforts they engaged in. Me, those people will not see. So Thich Nhat Hanh gives a more prosaic and more modern language, right? Someone who looks for me in form or seeks me in sound is on a mistaken path and cannot see the Tathagata. So remember again that Tathagata does not just refer to the historical Shakyamuni Buddha, right? It's just Tathagata refers to awakened nature itself. So the Gata is saying, if you're looking for awakened nature as showing up in some kind of special marks or some kind of special teaching, that is a mistake. You won't find it that way. You have to find it as the compounded nature of conditions. You have to find it as this more integrated phenomena level of understanding. So for that reason, and Kanza, interestingly, so I want to say something about the fact that there are 2 parts to the Gata here. So Kanza gives us 2 parts to the Gata, and Thich Nhat Hanh and Red Pine only give the first part. But interestingly, Pine mentions in his commentary that all but 2 of the editions that are currently extant include that second part of the Gata. And he thinks that it was a later edition, but there's actually, and he acknowledges this, no historical evidence one way or the other, as there isn't for a lot of things. But to me, it's of interest that almost all the editions actually include that second part of the Gata, because it's a further clarification. So from the Dharma should one see the Buddhas. And from the Dharma bodies comes their guidance. Yet, Dharma's true nature cannot be discerned, and no one can be conscious of it as an object. So you see, this is back to where we were a few chapters back. The Dharma itself is expressing itself as reality, right? So that's how we see the Buddhas. That's how we see awakened nature, as the Dharma that expresses itself as reality, as impermanence, as emptiness, as interconnectedness. So from the Dharma bodies comes their guidance. And what are the Dharma bodies? The Dharma bodies are us, are trees and mountains and planets and all kinds of things. Those are the Dharma bodies. Yet, Dharma's true nature cannot be discerned. So it's beyond human intellectual capacity to see reality that way. This is why it's often said that there's not somebody present for realization. There's not a you there. You have to dissolve in order for realization to happen. So the Dharma's true nature cannot be discerned in an intellectual capacity. No one can be conscious of it as an object. So where does that leave us? Zazen. That's where it leaves us. Zazen. Non-doing. Non-doing. Non-doing, non-intellectual, right? Sitting amidst the very activity of enlightenment and experiencing it moment after moment after moment. Taking in, by osmosis, if you will, right? I'm liking that word more and more. Taking in what it's teaching us, what this very existence that is a non-existence, what this very life is teaching us. So even though Kansa translates it with a capital D, from the Dharma should one see the Buddhas, I would say, yeah, okay, don't confuse that with just, the teachings in the books or the lectures or the Buddha's statues and so on. I would use it, dharmas with a lowercase d, all dharmas, all things. Right? Because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the indifferentiability of all things. And ourselves right in the midst of that. So not to look for some special form, but to realize that this life itself is already expressing that, right? Whether we're conscious of it or not. And when we're conscious of it, then we can actually translate it into wholesome activity. But this goes back, I think, maybe I'm remembering now Mark's question from last class, which is, if that's true, how does that work for people who are not conscious of it? But the way that it works for people who are not conscious of it is that they are equally demonstrating, right, the laws of impermanence, the laws of emptiness, the fact that suffering is created by, or unsatisfactoriness of life is created by this confusion that we have about that. So I want to cover one more chapter just briefly in about 5 minutes here, and then we'll have a few minutes for questions and comments there at the end. So chapter 27 says, those who set forth on the Bodhisattva path do not announce the destruction or the end of any Dharma. So it starts out, I should say again, with this question of the attributes. And I won't go over that again. And then it goes on to not conceiving of the destruction of a dharma. Or Thich Nhat Hanh translates it as not contending that all objects of mind are non-existence and cut off from life. So there are a couple of nuances here. One is that it's saying don't confuse the emptiness of things with a mind-only teaching, in my mind. That's what this is saying. So this, the fact that things are not permanent and not independently arising doesn't mean that there's no such thing as the world of form or the world of conditions. It's not negating that at all, right? It's not negating that there are 5 skandhas and that the 5 skandhas tend to hang together as this constantly moving thing called you, that you'd like to call you. So that's one aspect of what it's saying. It's also a little bit of historical context, because there was a concern that the Mahayana would bring on the age of the end of Dharma, that the Mahayana as an understanding of a path of practice that had as its aspiration Buddhahood, as distinct from the aspiration of becoming an arhat, that was going to be a problem. And it's a problem because of going back to the Bodhisattva's vow to free all beings, and therefore not try to limit the number of future lifetimes, right? So this is a place where the two paths diverge. So the Bodhisattva path doesn't concern itself with trying to have fewer future lifetimes. It concerns itself with being of the most help in whatever amount of time or bodies or beings that takes. And so that distinction, that very, clear sort of divergence of the path led to a lot of concern for some folks. And so this is also in part a response to that, saying it's not turning away from the Buddhist teaching. It's actually simply saying that if we understand the Buddhist teaching about no self, then it brings up this compassionate response. Because others are not other than me. Those we experience as others are not other than me. And frankly, I think some of this language about the fact that there's more merit by practicing this and teaching this sutra than offering a lot of jewels was also a threat to some folks. It's also a concern to some people. And so I want to also be clear, as Margaret pointed out, there's nothing wrong with devotion. Devotion can be a wonderful motivator on our path as well. And certainly giving is part of the Bodhisattva path. Giving is the first of the 6 paramitas, right? And is also the first of the 4 bodhisattva's methods of guidance. So perhaps this is also more subtly saying, don't worry about destroying the Dharma, right? The Dharma is not going to be destroyed by taking up this path of freeing all beings. And lastly, I would say it also says that you don't need to destroy a Dharma in order to understand emptiness. So, back to the metaphor of the scrambled letters, right? If you have 5 letters that make the word, you don't get to throw letters out in order to to understand what the word means. Nor do you add any letters. It's just right there. So for that reason, there's no Dharma, right? That would be adding, there's no actual teaching. That would be adding a letter. And there's no destruction of a teaching, like taking away a letter, right? All right, so now we're at the end of our time, and I still would like to hear just if anything that you all would like to say about. Okay, comments or questions? One at a time, I think. I don't know who has that background sound, but.
This teaching tonight has me thinking very hard about the idea of compassion, because at least as I look at lower D Dharma, everything as it is, if you take an individual out of that field for a moment and things are happening everywhere at once, and a lot of it, objectively, there's not much compassion going on in Mother Nature. It just really doesn't care. It does what it does. No merits being made, no merits being lost. It's the human element that brings in compassion to the whole equation. And it to me, it seems like it's often said that that's the natural outcome of emptiness, that you understand the interrelatability of all things, therefore you're compassionate. But I still see that that's a deliberate choice, that it's not a jewel that we polish off and we find that compassion that's been there all the time. It seems to me still to be kind of an idea you have to arrive at and choose to embrace that. Does that sound completely off track? And I guess the other question would be, where in the philosophy or the literature do you look to understand the compassion teachings better?
Well, so Mark, I think because most of us don't have a perfect experience of interconnectedness, then yes, compassion is a choice. Compassion is something that has to be cultivated. If we had a perfect experience of interconnectedness, then, again, you wouldn't be able to even conceive of harming beings, right? It's not like you would say, oh, I shouldn't do that. It's just more like, it just wouldn't make any sense, right? Like stealing from yourself, you know, like taking $5 out of one pocket and putting it in the other pocket and considering that, you know, it's like that. So, but I do agree with you that, yeah, for most normal beings, deluded, common, ordinary beings, yes, compassion is a choice. Compassion is something that we have to turn to. And the teachings on compassion, I mean, interestingly, this pretty much points directly to the precepts. No? So we can understand the precepts as describing the way things are, the way things actually work in the subjective world, right? If you do this, then this causes suffering, and if you do that, then that causes less suffering or frees you from suffering, right? So that at its most basic level, right, if we think about it in terms of like taking refuge in Buddha, taking refuge in awakened nature, right, that is perhaps the most comprehensive way of thinking about compassion, right? Like the Bodhisattva vow. Okay, I'm going to take refuge in awakened nature. And taking refuge in awakened nature means it's possible, actually, to free all beings because they have it too. They are it too. Yeah. So the study of the precepts and maybe not Kyoju Kaimon. Kyoju Kaimon, you know, was Dogen's commentary on the precepts. It's a little esoteric, you know, so his comments on the precepts, things like illuminated clouds and, you know, things like that. So maybe closer, like Shoakumakusa might be closer, right? Don't do evil, the fascicle called Don't Do Evil. Or I like some of actually Bodhidharma's old stuff, you know. He can veer into the very, very emptiness of emptiness stuff, but he can also be very direct about what's wholesome activity or not wholesome activity. So maybe have a look at the Four Sermons. There's a book called The Four Sermons. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Margaret? Uh-oh, you're muted. Hold on. There we go.
I unmuted?
Okay, now you're unmuted.
Okay. When you spoke of interconnectedness, I was thinking of Bernie Glassman's teaching that we are all one body. And you would no more ignore a damaged left foot because your right hand is fine. Mm-hmm. It's all one body. So if one part of it is suffering and hurting, then you are as much a part of it. Mm-hmm. If your left hand is crushed in a machine, you don't just say, well, it's the left hand, so it doesn't matter to me. You have to respond because it's your body. Mm-hmm. And that for me is very concrete and gets it out of the abstract and into, okay, everybody's my body. All the suffering in the world is my body. And I'm taking this vow to try to help.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And then
a little bit.
That's good. I'm glad that works. That example works. And then you have to consider how not to be overwhelmed in the midst of that, right?
Yes.
If everybody counts, then how to really respond.
And that's where Suzuki Roshi in that lovely little book said to the woman who was overwhelmed, just make it clear where you are.
Mm-hmm.
I love that.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you. All right, folks, we're over our time. So next class is last class, and thankfully we have very little material to go over, which means that we'll have at least a half an hour or so for questions, comments, any kind of things that you want to share, because I really want to hear your sharing from all of you next class. Okay? All right. Good night.